Um, yeah. Thanks, Frank. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts today. I know we're running late, and I am the last speaker, and one good thing is most of what I had to say has already been said, so I'll try to go through my slides rather quickly. And Frank, I know he keeps saying, I approved the product, but I really have to give credit to the team. I just signed the letter. All right, so my name is Sumati Nambiar. I am with the pediatric team at Johnson & Johnson. These are my views and not that of my employer. So what I thought I would do is I'll start on a personal note. For those in the audience that are not from India, my roots are in the small state in the southwest of the country, Kerala. While it's famous for its unique art forms and traditions, beaches and cuisine, the state also boasts of some strong social indicators such as high literacy, low infant mortality, and high life expectancy. And I had a pleasant surprise last evening when I learned that 2 members of Indo-US Rare actually also have their roots in my home state. So I was very happy for that. A bit about my professional background, just to put in context what frames my thinking, recognizing that at the core of all these experiences is the patients we serve. My training and work experience in India, now many decades ago as a pediatrician, then working as a pediatrician and as a pediatric infectious disease physician in the United States system, pivoting to being a regulator at the US FDA for a couple of decades, where I worked primarily in the infectious disease space, and now moving back to where I began 3.5 decades ago as a pediatrician in the pediatric team at Johnson & Johnson, really frames what I'm going to tell you in the next few minutes. What I thought I would do is in the next few slides, use my experience in infectious disease and in pediatrics to discuss some observations that really highlight gaps in global trials. And hopefully this will resonate with you in the context of representing patients from India in trials for rare or orphan conditions as well. As many of you are aware, antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, is a leading cause of death across the world and is really challenging many of the gains we've made in different arenas in the medical field, be it surgery, transplant, etc. So this is a publication from Lancet from 2022, which describes the global burden of bacterial antimicrobial resistance. So there were about 5 million cases associated with bacterial AMR in 2019 cases, and a quarter of them, 1.27 million, was really attributable to AMR. And more importantly, AMR is a leading cause of death around the world, but the highest burden is in low resource settings. So the graph of the figure, the world map on the other half of my slide, is really just representing the prevalence of resistance amongst one particular organism known as Klebsiella pneumoniae, and the prevalence of third-generation cephalosporin resistance. Because by the time you have third-generation cephalosporin resistance, you do not have too many treatment options. So unfortunately, you can see that Southeast Asia, including India, has a very high rate of third-generation cephalosporin, upwards of 70%. And certainly in the lay press, both within the country and globally, there's been a lot of discussion around the prevalence of antimicrobial resistance in India. So just to touch upon neonatal infections, which are an important cause of neonatal morbidity and mortality in many parts of the world, including India. And this is dated from just a few years ago, but at least 60,000 newborns in India die each year of neonatal infections that are resistant to the commonly available drugs. But unfortunately, and this is across the world, there's at least a 10-year lag between approval of antibacterial therapies in adults and then for children, particularly for neonates. So this is a study that was published by colleagues at the FDA, looking at the geographic distribution of antibacterial trials. You can forgive me for the acronyms, but those are just different kinds of infections, looked over 2 time periods. But even if you look at it in continuum from 2001 to 2017, you note that sites in Asia represent just a small sliver. But we've just seen that sites that India and other places in Asia do have a major issue with AMR and infections due to these resistant organisms. So similarly, we recently looked at pediatric study site locations, and a colleague of mine, Pam Simpkins at J&J, provided me, very generously provided me this and the next slide. So she looked at all industry-sponsored pediatric trials over a 5-year time period from 2018 to 2023. There were 834 of these trials, little over 21,000 site activations. And if you look at the geographic distribution of these sites, you do see that number of sites in Asia are very limited. The top 5 were US, Spain, Japan, Poland, and UK. Now, if you look at the sites in Asia a little more closely, you really see that just under 1% of these sites were from India. So what can we do to bridge the gap? So really reflecting on my own journey and now being part of the changing therapeutic landscape, this is what you get when you're old. I think it's really amazing and inspiring on one hand. But I think on the other hand, really highlights that there's more work to be done, really to address the needs of patients for many of the conditions we've not yet tackled. I think it also behooves us to ensure that these successes can benefit patients across the globe. So in the next 3 slides, I really tried to summarize my thoughts, some suggestions on what might help. And I said, many of these have already been mentioned. So I really compartmentalized them into sort of 3 buckets. The first one is science and data quality. The second one is on trial efficiencies. And the third one is regulatory considerations. And I think it's critical, and Peter Marks mentioned this as well. It's very important to focus on science. A good science and high data quality, I think, is a very critical element in our efforts to advance new therapies. It's really important when you have good science and good data that you can characterize the benefit and risks of the product. And that's really needed to make a sound appraisal. And this holds true across a range of conditions, including orphan and rare. That's something we have to keep in mind. And really good quality information is needed by all stakeholders, whether we are physicians, patients, regulators, or payers. We need good quality data, information to make best decision in the interests of our patients. The second bucket really is how can we overcome some of the barriers? I think first and foremost, we have to understand what the barriers are and then try to develop solutions such that global trials do include diverse populations, including those that are geographically dispersed and those with the greatest unmet need. Often those with the greatest unmet need do get left out, and that's what we really need to address. I think we've had a lot of discussion around capacity building. Very encouraging to hear all the work that's ongoing in India. We heard from speakers yesterday and this morning as well. And a lot of progress in establishing care pathway centers of excellence, etc. I think leveraging that information and incorporating that into the ecosystem of clinical trials, I think is sort of a logical next step to make sure that clinical trials do get done where there is the greatest unmet need. And lastly, with regard to regulatory systems and what regulators require, as a former regulator, I do think we should never consider regulatory requirements as regulatory hurdles. They are there for a purpose. There is a lot of flexibility in all the systems, and how best can we collect good data so that we can work within the regulatory framework of any given region. And I think at the same time, it is important to strengthen national regulatory systems. We focus only on stringent regulatory authorities, FDA, FDA, EMA, PMDA, etc. But I think it's very important to also strengthen national regulatory systems across the globe. And Peter Marks mentioned this. I think increased collaboration and alignment among national regulatory authorities, I think, is very critical to improve trial efficiencies and minimize redundancy. The amount of back and forth, and now witnessing it from the industry side, the amount of time it puts in and the amount of pain it creates, I think that's where we can really work to streamline processes. And then we really have to consider use of existing or novel pathways. Peter Marks mentioned Orbis, but there are other reliance pathways that can be used where regulatory authorities can work together. But at the same time, I think there is no intent here to compromise the sovereignty of any particular nation or any particular regulatory authority. I think that needs to be kept in mind. So I think in conclusion, what I would say is that the collective efforts of all stakeholders really will go a long way in ensuring that safe and effective therapies are available for individuals with rare or orphan disease across all regions of the world. So with that, I will thank you. Sorry, I went through it rather quickly. Wanted you to get to your coffee on time. So thank you.